Hello, everyone. As I just mentioned, I have been tidying my background, especially I've been told it's going to be recorded. So there we go. As Liz has just explained, we've been pulling together some various sources of data around physical activity to help us kind of understand the picture across Humber, but in North Lincolnshire too. And so I've got there's kind of two parts to today's kind of session. The first part is I'm going to present some of the physical activity data that we've got from the Children and Young People Active Life Survey that's done on an annual basis, and I'll see where that leads us in terms of which groups of young people might be doing more or less physical activity. And then there's a second part, which is as Liz has already articulated, we're trying to put some of this information or relevant information related to programs for children and young people, data that helps us find children and young people that might be more likely to be inactive, and so on and so forth. So hopefully what I'm going to try and do is kind of show where some of the greatest need is from a physical activity perspective, and then start to say, well, are these the kind of communities that we need to be kind of reaching into to try and work with children and young people? I am now going to just try and test my technology and share my screen. Can you all see that? I put it present.
We can, yes.
Yes, great, thank you. As Liz said, questions in chat. I'm happy to answer those as we go along, Liz and Sarah. So if you see them come up and you think it's relevant to a particular slide, just somebody just stop me and ask me. I think it's just, let's keep it informal like that. I think it'll be easier for people to get their head around the data. You know, I'm used to kind of presenting this stuff, so sometimes I assume knowledge that people might not have. So apologies up front if I do that. So the best way of sorting me out is stopping me and saying, you're not making sense, tell us what that means. Okay, so what am I going to cover? I'm going to cover a little bit in this first part of the conversation around the measures, physical activity measures that we've got data for, how that helps us look at physical activity levels at school, and I'll define that in a second, and outside of school, and we've got some information that's Humber level, and sadly for some of it we can't break it down any lower than Humber level, so we've got to look at some stuff at Humber level, and then we've got some stuff that's specific for North Lincolnshire, and we've broken that down, that information down as much as we can, really. So what we've got, I'll also explain when we go through this, to be able to actually break some of that information down without having to put a number of years together, but I will explain that as we go through. And then we've got a little bit about activities. What is it that children and young people like to do? Where are they getting their minute? What kind of activities are they getting their minutes from? And then we've got this thing around physical literacy, you know, so these five core competencies that are measured around children and young people's physical literacy and their relationship with how active or not children and young people are. So that's a rough structure. As I said, ask questions as we go along. What am I talking about when I'm talking about these measures and this survey? So there is an annual Active Lives Children and Young People survey that is commissioned by Sport England and carried out by one of the big research companies. It tries to reach around 300 people in every local, 300 children and young people in every local authority across the country, and this data is published on an annual basis. And it looks to measure the chief medical officer's recommendation of 60 minutes a day. And when we organise that on the chart, often we're looking at the red being the less active, so that's the proportion of young people that are doing less than 30 minutes a day as an average. The yellow is those that are doing between 30 and 55 minutes a day as an average, and then the green are those that are achieving 60 minutes a day as an average, so 420 minutes across the week, and we organize it by those. And a lot of, when I start to break the information down into kind of demographic groups, we'll be looking at that proportion that achieve 60 minutes a day and what that information can help us tell. Then there's this other measure that that helps us. It's slightly different. It looks at whether children and young people are achieving 30 minutes or more a day on average in the school setting. And what does that at school mean? Well, it means basically in the school normal hours of like 9 till 3, 9 till 3:15, whatever it might be. So it doesn't include breakfast clubs. It doesn't include after school clubs. It includes PE, break times, and anything that's done within the school hours. Anything that's breakfast clubs or after school clubs, well, that'd go into the outside of school, along with walking to and from school, along with going to the sports clubs, along with going out with your parents on a bike ride or whatever it might be, active play. All of that, a lot of that information that's done outside of those school hours and at the weekend is in that outside of school data. So we use this because well, you'll see when I get to the data, it prompts some interesting questions, because the data will only, remember, this is a survey and it will only get us so far, but it does help us to try and pick at things that we might want to try and understand better. I'll get to this a little bit later, but there'll be, when I show one of the charts, some of the demographic charts later, if I forget, remind me to explain some of the groups that we're looking at, because some of them might not make sense to anyone, but I should remember, hopefully. So we've had 3 years of this data so far, but remember that the third year has been, which would have finished at the end, for the last school year, obviously impacted quite significantly by the pandemic. So this is the values that have come from that third year of data for Humber. And you can see on the left-hand side that the sample in Humber for that period of time is considerably lower. That is the case nationally. The sample's been quite, because schools shut for that first lockdown and the survey didn't happen for a period of time. And then when it was picked up in a slightly different method. And so they've had quite a bit of a challenge, I think, on trying to put this information together to make it available to us. All we've got from that first year of information is headlines. So, and what I mean by that is things like this, the proportion of less active, fairly active, active. We haven't got the raw data to be able to drill down into it and break it down in any way yet. We're hopeful that it'll be made available, but it hasn't been made available yet. What this shows that across the Humber, over the 3 years, activity levels have increased and then dropped back a little bit. But that's not really surprising, bearing in mind lockdown and the impact that it has. And I will come back to the lockdown a little bit later and talk about some of the things that we're aware of that might be impacting in physical activity behaviour for children and young people and the impact that it's had. Okay, so sadly we can't bring the information right up to date. We're having to use the first 2 years of the survey, the data from the survey, because that's what's available to us to be able to analyse in greater depth. Okay, so what you've got here is Humber compared to England over the first 2 years, slightly above England in the first year, better than England in the second year. So well, I'm sorry, I'm looking at less active there. In terms of active, just a little bit lower in the first year and then better in the second year. And you can see it wobbling around a bit, which it's going to do. It's a population level survey. And so it's going to move around a little bit at Humber. Those differences will be less at a national level because the sample's so much bigger. Okay, but what we've got at Humber level is a situation in that second year of information that's a bit better than national, which is positive, because if you think of the Humber as a whole, I don't know if many of you are familiar with it, but the Humber doesn't quite look like England as a comparator. What do I mean by that? Well, there is, for example, a higher proportion of people from lower socioeconomic groups in the Humber than there is nationally. And that's certainly the case in North Lincolnshire. And we know that that group, a part of our community, is less likely to be active. So they're more likely to be inactive. So we know that if we're getting results that suggest we're doing better than England, then that's actually something quite positive for us to be building on. And we'll just have to see how that pans out over the years with the, especially with the pandemic having hit as it has. This is when we start to split that data out a little bit. Look at what the top right corner says on this slide. It's quite important. We've had to combine both years, the first 2 years of data, to be able to create a strong enough sample to be able to analyse it at a local authority area level. Okay, and this then just starts to show you the levels of activity there are across the 4 local authority areas that make up the Humber. And you can see there's quite a difference from, sadly, North Lincolnshire with the lowest proportion that are achieving an hour a day, that's at 39 percentage points, up to Hull, where it's 50 percentage points. So there's quite a bit of difference there, which is something for us to think about. And when I see this, I want to know, well, what's happening in North Lincolnshire? Which groups is it? Why does that seem to be so much lower? And I will come back to that. Okay, so this is the 60 minutes a day. This is achieving the Chief Medical Officer's recommendation. And so we're starting off from a North Lincolnshire perspective where comparatively, now, again, North Lincolnshire doesn't look like England. It looks more like the Humber because North East Lincolnshire and Hull look similar to it. But again, there's differences in here. So comparators like that are a little bit misleading. I'd focus more on actually what's going on in North Lincolnshire, and I will come to that shortly. This is what it looks like when we look at the proportion of children and young people that are achieving 30 minutes at school. And again, you can see there's quite a difference between the 4 local areas in terms of children and young people in these different areas. And again, when we look at it outside of school, there's a bit of a difference again comparatively. But I'm more interested in why is that? Why have we only got 35%? What do we know? Which groups is it that are getting more minutes at school or less minutes at school? What can we tell from that? Which groups are getting more and less minutes outside of school? What can we tell from that? And I will come to that very shortly. Oh, I forgot to put this in. This is really quite helpful. This is just to help with some of the terms that you're going to start to see on the next slide now. So we've got a situation where North Lincolnshire has got the levels of children that are achieving the Chief Medical Officer's recommendations aren't particularly high comparatively to some of our geographic neighbours. They're not as strong. So what's going on there? Well, I'm going to start to break it down into different groups of children and young people shortly, and I'm going to be using some terms. The first thing is around the survey asked children and young people to identify whether they require extra support. Sport England used the term disability for that group. We think that's probably a bit broad, especially with responding to this question as a primary age child. So we've gone to using this term of needs extra support, no extra support. So extra support, no extra support is what you'll see need extra help, no extra help. You'll see on the charts that are following, and that's related to this, whether they've got their perceptions as whether they require extra support or not. We've also got this FAS score, Family Affluence score. Now, when we do a lot of these kind of surveys with adults, we ask them a series of questions like income and qualifications and job, and we use them to create put people into socioeconomic groups, an SSEC, and we know that there's a group of, and it goes from 1 to 9, and 6 to 8 are widely regarded as lower socioeconomic status, and it relates, to some degree with affluence. Of course it does. Those questions are quite difficult for children and young people to answer. So there's some clever boffins that have come up with a way of asking a set of questions that help us create a family affluence score for those children and young people. We can make some assumptions, but it is only an assumption that those in low family affluence score would probably fall within low socioeconomic groups. What these questions are things like, how many bedrooms has your house got? Do you own your own washing machine? Have you been on holiday in the last 12 months? Did you go abroad? And so it uses a series of questions like that are easier for children and young people to answer, rather than asking them about, well, who earns the most money and what qualifications does your mum or dad have? It asks these questions to then apply this family affluence score. We will be using low, medium, high, and you can see how the scores have been applied to those different definitions. And then year groups, a bit more straightforward. 1 to 2. The one thing that I'm going to say here, which is important, and I'll remind ourselves again when we get to the data, is that those in year 1 to 2, the survey is completed by the parents. Everyone else from years 3 onwards complete the survey themselves. But we'll see some interesting patterns in that year 1 to 2. And for the sake of today, I'll explain some reason why we've done some of the analysis that the way we have when we get onto the slides. So they're the key groups that you need to be conscious of. The others I think you'll be aware of, like gender and so on and so forth. Let me explain what we've done with the data. I hope nobody's taking a photograph of this, and I'll get in trouble if Sport England catch me. But I need to just explain something to you. We've removed the 1 to 2 data. Okay, when we started to look at North Lincolnshire, what you've got here is a chart or 3 charts everywhere at school and outside of school. If you just look at the everywhere chart on the left hand side for now, don't worry about the yellow and blue and all the red lines. I'll explain some of that in a minute. You don't need to worry about it, but just look at how high those achieving 60 minutes is in our years 1 to 2. Now the sample for that group is very small, but when it gets weighted by Sport England, it can have quite a bit of an impact. And so what we've done for the analysis today to just help us tease out outside of those year 1 to 2s, where are the issues? Which groups should we be more greater? We've removed the years 1 to 2 from the sample because A, it's really small and we can't really publish it anyway, and B, when it's weighted, it can have quite a dramatic effect, or not dramatic, but it can have an effect on where that black line is, which makes things look potentially worse than they are. So we've removed the 1 to 2s from the sample. Now, when we remove the 1 to 2s from the sample, we get this. So what we've got here is the green towers is the proportion of children and young people in North Lincolnshire that are achieving an hour a day on average by these different demographic factors, and I've explained some of those to you. The red line is the confidence interval. For those of you that are into confidence intervals, you're quite happy to have a conversation with me, or even more preferably with my colleague Martin, if that's what you want to get into. It just tells us that we're confident that the value for that particular group falls within that red line. Okay, the yellow dots are England, the same value for England for that group, and the blue diamonds are the value for Humber. So what you can start to see when you look at this is how those green towers are below Humber and England consistently across the board. So we've got quite an interesting thing straight away here, in the sense that we've something cultural going on, something systemic, that's hitting across all groups of young people. But there's something here that's worth us having a conversation and having a think about. And what you also start to see is some of the differences, some of the inequalities that we get. It's not surprising to me that low family affluence is on the far left, with the lowest proportion achieving at 60 minutes, and high family affluence is on the far right. That is often the case, not always, but is often the case. That inequality of nearly 20 percentage points is bigger than national, it's bigger than Humber. So the difference between those two groups is larger than it is in those using England and Humber as a comparison. What's a bit more interesting is the gender inequality not really there in North Lincolnshire. It's a percentage point. What's more of an issue, or more of a challenge, is this family affluence being associated to that low family affluence. What's really struck me on this is some of the age groups as well. It's unusual that years 9 to 11 are that high. They're usually the age group that's at the other end of the scale, often with year 3 to 4. So we often see year 3 to 4 where they are on this chart, but it's very rare to see 5 to 6 where they are on this chart. They are usually much more into the middle, if not more onto the right hand side. So there's certainly something going on in primary schools that we need to be thinking about, because it's unusual that those 4 years are all down on the left hand side. Now, nationally, if you just look, it's hard to do this, I know, but if you just look at the pattern of the yellow dots, you can see that actually years 3 to 4 and in Humber as well is actually one of our lowest groups when it comes to, or one of our sensitivity of my mouse, one of our lower groups when it comes to achieving an hour a day across the week, which, as I've got to admit, when I first saw this, I was quite struck by that. and it'd be interesting to get people's thoughts on why they think that is. And then what we've got in North Lincolnshire is a situation where it's a little bit lower again. But more interestingly is what's going on with 5 and 6. This is one of our more active years. 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 are usually towards the right hand side of this chart, and the 9 to 11s are usually a bit going the other direction. So there's something going on in these age groups that we need to try and think about a little bit more. Moving on to at school. Okay, the same pattern of the data. Green towers are North Lincolnshire, blue diamonds are the Humber value, yellow dots are the England value, and the black line across the middle is the average level for this age group. Okay, what we see here is low family affluence has moved up one, and years 5 to 6 have dropped to the bottom. That I've not seen it before, if I'm honest. So I'd be really interested into what you think is going on there. Low family affluence often down there. We see this pattern here that strikes me. The first time I looked at this data in this kind of way and saw this pattern, I was really struck by how can we get almost, what is that? That's a 17 percentage point difference in terms of the proportion of children managing to do 30 minutes at school between low family affluence and high family affluence. What is creating that inequality? And we've seen it in other places. It's not something that's unique to North Lincolnshire or Humber. You see it to some degree nationally, though the gap isn't as big nationally. And it's what's going on. And what we can observe, I'll save that later. So there's something going on at school where we've got some inequalities, and I can understand it between different years. You know, different commitments to PE, different lesson structures, etc., etc., etc. How's that maybe playing out? I you know, with low family affluence, I'd welcome your thoughts. The other inequalities here at school, you know, if you remove low family affluence 5 to 6, the others, you know, there's not much difference between boys and girls. There's not much difference between those require extra help and those that don't. And from an ethnic minorities, and it is the whole of the group that isn't white British, and that's all that we can get. That sample is just about enough for us to utilize, and so it would include white, other, and so on and so forth. And again, that is not too bad comparatively to the other groups in North Lincolnshire, but below obviously where things are for both Humber and England. Outside of school, I'd expect a bigger inequality between low family affluence and high family affluence here. You know, affluence dictates to some extent what children are able to access, and opportunities that they're able to go to, and clubs that they're able to get into, and green spaces that are available to them, and etc., etc., etc. So I'd expect it more on this slide than I probably would on the previous slide in school. You get a bit more of a gender gap opening up here between boys and girls. That wasn't much of a gap in the other, but it's a little bit more of a gap when you get it for this particular measure of 30 minutes or more on average outside of school. So just be conscious of that. That might suggest that our supply and our opportunities in the community are reaching boys better than girls. It might be about walking. I don't know. We can unpick a little bit of that, but not a lot in terms of the sample. But you'll see again that we've got those years 3 and 4, 5 and 6 down to the left hand side again, which is unusual, especially for the 5s and 6s. You can see by the yellow and blue dots how high those towers normally are. But again, there is that pattern of generally being a bit lower across the board. I've got zoomed out to Humber data now, because well, you can see that we can't really show you much. so even when we go out to a Humber level, we can't really break down the data by different ethnic groups that well, which is a real shame. So we've got to take at the moment, until we've got more years of data, then we might be able to do something with it. We've got to take those national factors into consideration. So those black dots show you what that proportion of achieving 60 minutes a day nationally looks like. We've had to combine the data together, and still we can't really get much information for a Humber, which is frustrating. Just going to go out to the Humber level for a couple more slides now, just to show you how some of these groups interplay with each other. We can't do this sadly at a North Lincolnshire level because we just don't have enough data yet to be able to do it. But what we've done here, so what we've done here, we've got the whole of the primary age children and young people, so everyone that's in year 3 to 6, and then we split it into family affluence, low family affluence, medium family affluence, high family affluence, and then we split it by gender. And what you can see here is the differences between boys and girls. This is at Humber level, remember. The differences between boys and girls across family affluence, and actually there's a bit of an inequality at a Humber level in all 3 of those groups. But when you look at boys and girls from low family affluence, it isn't particularly strong, and well below that black line from a girl's perspective as well. So we can start to dig into this information a little bit more. What happens when we look at this by at school and outside of school? So at school is on the left hand side. Well, that inequality isn't as big, apart from what is it that high family affluence boys are getting in school that helps a higher proportion of them manage to achieve 30 minutes a day? Or is it that boys and girls in that group are doing more maths and English to catch up, or missing out on break times or PE because of behavioural issues? What is it that might be creating that inequality? We've had some feedback because we've seen this data, as you can tell, elsewhere, and we've started to try and get conversations going about it. You know, we've had some feedback around energy levels of children and young people in from low affluence families being lower because their food intake has not been as good as we'd like it to be, and there's lower energy levels. There was all kinds of bits of feedback coming. I'd really welcome your thoughts on what you think that might look like locally, because we are certainly seeing differences at school in terms of children and young people from different family with different levels of family affluence. This is secondary school data, the same information for secondary school. So this is our years 7 to 11. You can start to see that girls get a little bit higher than boys on this one, which is quite interesting at a Humber level. Remember, we're out to, but there's still this, apart from in that low family affluence, the other two, there's still a bit of an inequality, and then we've broken it down again by in school and at school and outside of school. We see some really interesting patterns in this at times. Sometimes we see that the at school high family affluence plummets, and particularly when you can break this information down and you look at the 9 to 11s, you see some really interesting patterns in the sense that both boys and girls, the levels of achieving 30 minutes at school, or indeed less so the 60 minutes, but certainly 30 minutes at school for high family affluence children, can plummet. And when we've had conversations with partners as to why we might observe that, people have come back and said the pressure of academics, the pressure from the family and from the school to achieve in those latter years of secondary school. We aren't seeing, from the data that we've got available to us at the Humber, we're not seeing that pattern anywhere at the moment. We haven't explored everywhere yet, but we haven't seen it. What we're seeing more consistently here is this difference between low family affluence and high family affluence. And just look at what that looks like outside of school at a Humber level. It's quite stark. A little bit on activities. We could get some stuff for North Lincolnshire, so this will just give you. So we're into a slightly different measure again this time, once a week. So the proportion of the children and young people that have done these activities to a degree that it moderate intensity, so their heart rate raised a bit, they might have got a bit warm, a brisk walk, so they've done it for any number of minutes to an intensity that they start to get out of breath a little bit. And so you can see the levels for walking to and from school, and walking for leisure with the family or on their own, and how that compares to England and to Humber. And then we've got cycling. We're intrigued by cycling because Humber has got some good, relatively strong cycling rates, both for children and young people and for adults. Definitely, certainly in the Hull area, but other areas as well. And so we're intrigued by the role that cycling can play, which is good. And then we've got all of these different types of group. Well, some of these are kind of singular activities, but some of them are also grouped. And you can see that consistently, apart from that active travel and swimming, interestingly, above the other two, you can see that comparatively, they're a little bit, we're getting the proportion of children and young people that are doing these activities once a week is just a bit lower on most of those kind of activities that we've got data for. Physical literacy. This is the last little section, and then if I've missed any questions, we can pick that up. We can have a chat about some of the things that I've raised along the way. What on earth am I on about when I talk about physical literacy? Well, the survey asks all children and young people questions on these 5 factors in the middle of the screen: enjoyment, confidence, competence, understanding, and knowledge. You can see the questions on the left-hand side, and the children and young people are asked to give a score or answer between strongly disagree, neither agree nor disagree, agree, strongly agree. Okay, and Sport England analyze and encourage others to analyze what's going on in that strongly agree category, because what the data shows is that the stronger the strength of agreement, the more likely young people are to be achieving 60 minutes on average a day. So they're achieving the Chief Medical Officer's recommendation. So the stronger the agreement, the higher levels of activity. And I'll just go on to show you that a little bit. So so before I do that, so what the right-hand side little table is telling us is that in North Lincolnshire, 49% of the children and young people strongly agreed with those questions around enjoyment. They strongly agree. 39% have said that, strongly agree that they're confident to take part. 25% strongly agree that they're competent to take part. 66% said they understand it, and so on and so forth. What I would say about those, and this is in the notes on the slide, so it is in the slide that you just can't see it, but each of those factors, all of them, bar one, which I think is only maybe a percentage point. Actually, I think the understanding's a little bit higher, and then the other 4 are all slightly lower than Humber and England by 3-4 percentage points. Okay, so we're seeing a slightly lower proportion of children and young people across most of these factors that strongly agree with the statements. Okay, and this matters. So I'm going to show you a slide in a minute, and this just helps us explain the slide, really. So they're asked the question, we picked on enjoyment here, asked the question, I enjoyed taking part in exercise and sports. They strongly agree with it, or they don't, i.e. all 4 other answers. We put them into a group. If they strongly agree to it, we then looked at what proportion of those that strongly agree are achieving 60 minutes a day compared to those of the proportion that don't strongly agree. What's the proportion of them that achieve 60 minutes a day? And what you get is, for those that strongly agree, 46% of them achieve an hour a day, compared to 25% for all other answers. Okay, so it makes a difference. That strength of agreement makes a really big difference. Now you can see that across all 5 factors for North Lincolnshire, and you can see the gaps for some of these factors behind, with England and Humber as comparators, though they are a little bit unfair. And what you notice straight away is just the impact that it really does make. So, it nearly doubles levels, the proportion of children and young people achieving an hour a day if they strongly agree with enjoying physical activity and sport and physical activity in North Lincolnshire. So you can see that pattern, and you can see which of the factors are more important potentially than others. Confidence, enjoyment, you can just see how the differences between those two and where they are in comparison to England and Humber. Now, we know that COVID has had an impact. We know the pandemic has had an impact. We know that it has, as you can see from that very first slide of data that I shared with you, activity levels have dropped, less active has increased. We know that that's disproportionately affecting certain groups of the children and young population, particularly our Black children and young people. And so from a low family affluence perspective, held their own to some degree in the data that we've got available. Other data suggests it might not be as positive as that, but it hides some real differences, which is what we need to be conscious of. And Sport England have produced a couple of reports that, you know, based on the third year of data, which I think are really quite useful if you're in this space and you're interested in it. I would encourage people to have a read. I'd particularly encourage people to have a read of what they've called the summer term report, which is basically the period of time as we came out of lockdown and until the end of the last school year. And I'm picking up on it here because what we know is during lockdown activity levels have definitely suffered, and they suffer, you know, we'd expect them to, wouldn't we? Supply has all stopped. You're relying then on parents, whoever's at home, carers at home, enabling children and young people to try and get some of their minutes in. So we have seen this pattern of activity levels dropping quite dramatically during lockdown. We also saw that actually it took quite a while for them to return. Well, interestingly, you saw on a couple of slides ago just how important sporting activities were and how popular they were. Well, a lot of that will have been removed to some. The organised, structured element of that has been removed to some degree. One of the things that we're really interested in from this report, though, and only time will tell, was some of the subtle shifts in physical literacy measures. Overall, across the year, really not that much difference. So you couldn't, if you looked at just the overall report, you really couldn't see this. But when you saw the summer report, you started to just see that there were drops in positive attitudes for competence, for confidence, and for enjoyment. Now, they're only, well, they're not that small. There's quite a bit of a difference at the moment. But if those trends continue, if we go back to what we've just talked about how these really strongly associate with higher levels of achieving 60 minutes a day, if we start to see a trend of these things continue to decrease, activity is going to go with it. And so we've got a bit of a challenge here. We've got to, you know, from my own experience of dusting my kit off and doing a bit of cricket coaching last week, you know, the kids that have come back observationally less confident, you know, more attentive, which was quite interesting, but certainly there's some challenges around confidence. There's observationally that some of the children and young people have gained weight. Fitness is certainly something that we're going to be probably working on more this summer than we have done in previous summers. You know, that's a snapshot from me in one little part of the world doing a little bit of cricket, but we are hearing those things elsewhere in other evidence. And so we've got this challenge around children and young people losing this ability time to be active and support to be active, and then coming back with a different, possibly slightly less positive attitudes towards it. We need to pay attention to this, and it hides some really interesting nuances, certainly around different ethnic groups, and certainly around family affluence. And interestingly, one of the groups that's done well, if I can say it like that, have been more active during the pandemic is teenage girls. What's going on there? Well, we can make some assumptions. No PE, choice to pick the activity that I want to do. Probably more likely to be walking, maybe more like a little bit of cycling. You know, we've certainly seen quite big increases in those two activities. More freedom to the way that I go and do that, but it's actually one of the groups that's actually held its own, and if not improved slightly during the pandemic period. Summary: there is a really, you know, the lower level of activity across the board, which is quite interesting. There's something in my head that makes me think about the culture of being active. It makes me think about the demographics of the area. It also, we're seeing this quite a difference between low and high affluence families, and I think that's where I'd have the greatest concern, especially as I know that there's the proportion of the population that are in lower socioeconomic groups in the area is bigger than certainly what you've got at a national level. So we've got more potential families in this space from these in this group than we have elsewhere. There's limited data around ethnicity at a humble level. We've had a look at the data because obviously, as I mentioned earlier, if the sample's too small, Sport England have asked us not to publish it below a certain size, and so we've had a look at the data though, and there seems to be a bit more of a challenge within the Black community, and that is certainly coming out on the impact of the pandemic, from the impact of the pandemic. And then we've got this situation with physical literacy that overall looked okay, but in that summer term, we are seeing shifts. We are seeing children and young people reporting less confidence, less competence, which is something that we need to think about. How do I stop sharing my screen? That's what I'm trying to do. Hello. Stunned silence. Everybody asleep.
No, we're still here.
It's
just maybe just having a bit of a stretch, but no, really insightful stuff, Scott. And I guess my main thoughts from a school's point of view and the amount of investment that's going into primary schools, particularly around PE school sport and physical activity, is a little bit of a worry. So that was my main findings, but that's kind of my main day job. It'd be great if anybody has any questions. I know a couple of thoughts have been put in around the secondary girls. That's really quite insightful in terms of their activity around the use of social media and actually girls getting together and being active together, maybe doing that. So thanks for that insight. Has anybody else got any questions that they want to pose to Scott before we move on around that data?
Scott, I'm quite interested in the out of school data, quite particularly, I suppose, in the bit about girls as well. And I am wondering, and I've got a lot of colleagues obviously on the call who do work with children out of school and things like that. Have we got, or do we know of examples in other local authorities where perhaps, you know, they are running things for girls that encourages girls to get more active? Are there things like girls only groups and boys only groups, if that makes sense?
Yeah, particularly when it comes to ethnicity.
Right. And are they making an impact on outcomes for those young people and the data?
Just I'm sure they're making an impact of some sort. We've got to just be conscious that this is a population level survey, so it doesn't measure specific interventions like that because the sample's not anywhere near big enough to do so. So and the one, actually possibly two, Mags, I'd encourage you to look up, and I can probably find some links. Gloucestershire have, for at least 2002 I think it started, so for nearly 20 years have been doing a school survey and they get about 94% of children and young people that are at school complete this survey every 2 years, and they've got some wonderful data. You can imagine it's enormous, and they can look at correlations with certain interventions that have been done at school. But I think they're only just starting to. So, for example, they're looking at, like when I did some work with them 18 months or more now, they were looking at the impact of the Daily Mile at the schools that it was in and the schools that it wasn't in. But you need that kind of level of information to be able to show that cause and effect directly like that. Right. So at a population level, we would see the amalgamation of many things occurring that could create the change. But on the sample size that we've currently got, Oxfordshire is another area that are just starting that survey. And trying to get it into as many schools, but you need a much bigger sample to be able to show that direct cause and effect to interventions at this kind of level. In terms of measuring those interventions and their effectiveness on the children and young people that they reach, there'll be quite a lot of literature out there around girls. This Girl Can would probably be the best starting point to look at that literature.
Brilliant, thank you for that.
That kind of throws up a good question, just in terms, Sada, just to bring you in if you're there, just in terms of the adolescent lifestyle survey and the primary lifestyle survey, just to kind of see if what's being pulled through on this kind of marries with that data. Would that be something that Heather could maybe look into?
Yeah, she could. Yeah, yeah, that's fine.
How many cycles has that been through? Scott, for your information, I think there's a 3-year cycle, primary, adolescent and college survey that run on a 3-year cycle. Covers not just physical activity but general education and wellbeing and stuff in schools, which has a really high take up in North Links, but I'm not sure how far it goes back.
What kind of sample is it?
Question, Sada? I know all secondary schools do it. I think it's pretty high.
Yeah, it's well over 90%, I think.
Well, wow. Well, even if it, you can get all. Just to tell, let me tell it through the Gloucestershire example. So they obviously started well before, whenever it was in the 2000s. They obviously started before the active life survey and the chief medical officer's recommendation being written and how it was, and it's written in a way. It's like 30 minutes. It's based on 30 minutes, if I remember. So it's like the last but one chief medical officer's recommendation, and they've kept it like that. And I think it's brilliant that they've kept it like that because they can observe the trend. And so they haven't. In fact, I think in Oxfordshire they're going to ask the active lives kind of method as well. And what's really quite intriguing when you start to look at that data, because the sample size is so big, you can start to try and track it to different programs that have been done, particularly around the school environment. It becomes more difficult outside of school, but done around the school environment, you can actually look at the cause and effect of certain interventions, and because the scale of the return is so big. So it's an interesting chunk of data. However they ask the question around physical activity, it'd be interesting to look at it.
Yeah, I think I'd be interested in looking at that actually, Scott. If you have a link you can send us.
I can send you the link to the Gloucestershire stuff. Yeah, I will.
Yeah, please.
Somewhere.
I think we're probably. I have a feeling that it's probably we've done 3 or 4 of the surveys now. I think we've probably done it for the last 6 or 7 years. That doesn't tally up, but I was hoping Heather would be on this meeting, but she's not, I don't think. And that's one of our data people, Scott, that leads on the surveys.
Okay.
Schools. So
let's have a look at that.
Yeah.
Can I ask if I want to ask a question? This I'm fascinated by it. That particularly boys, we see it particularly boys. I can't say that that's the case in North Lincolnshire because I can't break the data down. But boys in high affluent families seem to be much more efficient at achieving 30 minutes at school compared to boys in low family affluence. What's the take of people on why that is?
Wow. Well, I've sort of got a map going on in my head now all of a sudden around potentially all the health inequalities that the boy from a lower affluent family is more prone to increased risk of. So if they're of increased weight, they potentially don't want to take part, have all the excuses. So I think it strongly links to health inequalities. That's from my perspective, being public health.
Yeah.
Just as a start off, I mean, I could really do with a piece of paper and put down what's in my head, really.
Yeah. We've heard that. That's come up in other conversations that more likely to be overweight, more likely to be obese.
Links to bullying potentially as well, you know, so not wanting to take part in physical activity.
It's really we've done a bit of work in Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, and this pattern came out in Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, and so we actually able to get some head teachers in a room together from primary schools and had a conversation with them around. We showed them the data, talked to them about it, and you know it was a bit of you know, none of them wanted to admit that it was like that in their school. They all turned around and said, well, it's not like that in my school, which straight away makes me just think we maybe not even realize we had a problem until now, which was quite intriguing, because they were all then able to actually sit there and think, you know, and say things like, well, in other schools it could be this, and a lot of that was around timetabling, around extra support required to get grades, to get up to standards. You know, it being used, taking break times away, being used as a punishment for poor behaviour. You know, it was really quite interesting. And then people touched on the weight side of things as well. And that wider health inequalities is an interesting angle to this.
Yeah, and there's about, I mean, when you said about the year 5 to 6, I was thinking, why should we be surprised? Because in North Links, our NCMP data for year 5 to 6 always show that cohort is high, above national and regional average.
Right.
So this verifies that then, if there's reduced physical activity in that age group.
Yeah. Well, what's really intriguing with that, you know, 5 to 6 generally, nationally, reasonably active group. My experience of some of that is clubs kicking, after school clubs kicking more, and the offer is slightly distorted more. You know, the club offer as well starts to, in that outside of school space, starts to become more online for those, you know, older children. So I can understand it in the outside of school space. It's when you start to get into the at school bit that's intriguing me the most.
I think we always talk about school to club links and kind of that being a way, but I guess picking up on that point, Scott, if a kid is active outside playing cricket clubs, football clubs, are they then more likely to do it in school because they've got that interest? So I guess it's whether it comes back in and actually the high affluence of the kid that's playing outside school actually has got mates that he plays with at school, so he actually wants to carry on doing that inside of school.
And go back to the physical literacy. If they're playing outside, if those young people are playing outside of school, they're more likely to be competent. They're more likely to be enjoying it more, etc., etc. So you get this whole kind of space. And what we've got a challenge with, I think, in North Lincolnshire is just how all of those groups comparatively didn't look great. They were all, you know, that what we would be interesting would be to compare you to some of your statistically nearest neighbours. I would have thought that North East wouldn't be far off one of your statistically nearest neighbours. I don't know. I haven't looked. But we can basically identify. We can use a model called nearest neighbours model, and we can compare North Lincolnshire to a number of other local authority areas that are demographically more like North Lincolnshire than England is. And it would be interesting to see how the data compared to those.
I think I was on a call about secondary school kind of insight into young people. There's quite a lot of surveys going around with the new teacher training money that's coming through, and Just on what peer pressure, maybe the younger kids, if children are starting to get into clubs earlier and they're getting that competency, if the gap's opening and a child feels that they aren't adequate to go and play against, you know, a boy that's in the football team, then actually their enjoyment and their competence would drop off earlier potentially as well. But that's been identified at secondary schools. Whether it's now eking into primary may well be another factor.
That is an interesting one. Sorry, I'm just going to put some of these in the chat. Okay, shall we? Is there any other questions? I feel a bit weird sat here looking at a screen of initials and just seeing myself. If there's no other questions, I'll. Oh, go on, Mags. Were you going to ask something?
No, sorry, I wasn't. I was thinking. I was reading just one of them and reflecting. That was all. So you're fine.
Okay. I will. Shall I take us to the web map?
That'd be great. Thanks, Scott.
Let me just get this up so I can share my screen. Right. Okay. Can you all see that? Can you all see my internet browser with the map up?
We can.
Great, thank you. Let me just let's explain it first. That's probably the place to start. This is a map, a web map that we have started putting information into across Humber. What you've got in the middle panel is the map that we can zoom in and out on down here. I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm also going to put the link in the chat box if I can remember how to do that. Okay, you can't break it. That's the first thing to say. Do whatever you want with it. It might get glitchy. That's probably to do with your internet connection or your browser. If you've got an old browser, it might have some functionality that doesn't work, but I think that'd be quite rare, and you can't break it. So don't worry about it. Even if you think you've dragged a dot off somewhere else, you haven't. It'll just go back to it. So what have we got? We've got the map in the middle. We've got this panel down the left-hand side of the schools, okay, of all the schools in Humber. On the right-hand side, we've got an information panel that tells us what we're looking at. So what it's telling us at the moment is that it's got you can see the boundary of Humber on, and then we've got some red areas. You can see these little red patches. There's some of the high priority areas that I'm going to test with you. You're the first to see them. And then we've got these dots. Well, they're the schools that are doing 2 hours of PE, green if they are, pinky red if they're not, grey if we don't know. Okay, and that's what you're looking at the moment. You can zoom in and out of the map down here. Okay, sometimes it's going to go wonky and all over the place. That's because of the sensitivity of my mouse. You've also got this little bookmark up here. If you press on that bookmark, it'll take you to certain levels of the map. So if I click on the Humber region, it centres the Humber in the middle of the screen. If I click on North Lincolnshire, it'll bring North Lincolnshire to the middle of the screen, and it just helps you navigate if, for example, it zooms in too much or whatever it might be. You've then got these 3 squares layered on top of each other. That's our layers of data, and you can see which ones I've currently got ticked. So we've currently got the district boundaries ticked, the local authority boundaries. We've got 2 hours of PE ticked for primary schools, and we've got these suggested high priority areas. I'm just going to take all of them off for now, and that's what happens. We've just got to play map. So let's just put the boundaries back on to begin with. So you can put these layers on. Some of them, you know, especially if you're putting a kind of like heat map layer on. So let's just put what do I mean by a heat map layer? Which is a good one. Lower socioeconomic groups. Right, we get a low. So this is the proportion. It tells us over here the proportion of people within these little patches that are from lower socioeconomic groups. Okay, so this would help us find some of our lower affluence families because they're I would have thought very likely to be in lower socioeconomic groups. So the darker the blue, the more of the population in that particular patch that is in lower socioeconomic group. Okay, so you've got this kind of heat map effect, and it tells you the values of the different colours in this panel on the right side. Okay. Now, if I was to put some kind of dots on there, let's pick on primary schools, it tells you where all the primary schools in relationship to where our lower socioeconomic communities are. Okay, so you can overlay some of these things quite tidily. Some things overlay less tidily because it gets a bit more complicated, like putting two different heat maps on top of each other. It doesn't look and it isn't as effective as what you'd like it to be, but it still can work to some degree. Okay, if you wanted to I needed to leave that one on and turn this one off. If you wanted to pick a school, I'm gonna just zoom in to Scunthorpe. I'm gonna try and find the school that I wanted to pick on. I think it's that. It is. Okay, so Westcliff Primary School. I click on that dot. Okay, I can find it on this list over here, and let me just take us to Western Primary School. It take us and zoom us into Western Primary School. Okay, let's just come back out to Westcliff, wasn't it? I think yes. So and then it highlights. So this panel, if you know the school that you're looking for, will take us to that particular school. What comes up when we click on a school is this little information box showing us the name of the school, what type of school it is, what trust it's in, its postcode. It tells us the name of the head teacher. It gives us the school roll numbers. It gives us the proportion that are in free school meals. Gives us the you can see the things that it gives us. It gives us a range of different information. It gives us our childhood NCMP data, our overweight and obesity data for reception year and year 6, and then it gives us a number of children that have got a SEND statement or an EHC plan, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you get this pop-up box that tells us about the school, but we can then use this. So where we left our data piece was that we've got this challenge around low family affluence children and young people. Okay, now we can't map that as it is, but we can, as I've already mentioned, talk about lower socioeconomic groups. Okay, so when we turn our layer for lower socioeconomic groups on, we can see that Westcliff Primary School falls within an area where the proportion of people in lower socioeconomic is quite high, and if we can click on some of these areas, it'll tell us how high. So in this particular area that cuts across the school, it's 62% of the local population are employed in routine and semi-routine jobs. If I click on this one on the other side, it's 57%. Okay, so you can click on these things and it'll give you some of the data so you can see some of the values. Okay. What we have started to do is because at a Humber level, while the inequality between high family affluence and low family affluence at a Humber level isn't as significant as it is in North Lincolnshire, it's still significant as it is nationally. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do is look at how we might go about prioritising and identifying where those children and young people are in greater numbers. So what we've tried to do is we've used some other factor, or we've decided to use another factor rather than using lower socioeconomic group, because this data would come from the census, and as you will all know, because I hope for you all filled in your form, that is now 10 years out of date, and we're just about to get the new data. So we haven't got more recent information for lower socioeconomic group, but we do have more recent information for income deprivation affecting children. And this is one of the indices. So you might have heard of the indices of multiple deprivation, which is this other tablet we've got on here. One of the indices of IMD is the income deprivation affecting children index. And this is it is exactly what it says on the tin. And what you can see is that this patch that around Westcliff Primary School is in one of our most deprived areas for income deprivation affecting children. Okay, and we've decided to use this to help us find, use this factor to help us maybe prioritize a few areas. But we've also used some other factors. The reason why we've used this is because it's a bit more up to date than IMD is. And so let me just show. So we've used that income deprivation affecting children. Let's just turn that off for a second. We've also used young people age 15. Under 15. So this is using 2019 mid-year estimates. So every year estimates are done that give us a sense of the population numbers in certain communities in these smaller geographical areas. And as you can see here, this patch that Westcliff Primary School falls into is got quite a high proportion of the local population that are under the age of 15 as projected in 2019. So it's between 22 and 35, so quite high. And if we click on some of these, it'll tell us what it is. 29% that one, 26% that one. So you can see up here that it's telling us how high, what the proportion of children and young people is in the local population. So you can see that all of these little areas here, these little areas, by the way, are called lower super output areas. It's just a way of organizing census data, and it helps us map information. And you can see that around Westcliff Primary School, we've got quite an, even here, we're up to at least 1 in 5 of the population in this area generally is somebody under the age of 15. And so we've got quite a lot of children and young people living in this community. And as we could tell from the data that I showed you earlier, we know that there's more families in lower socioeconomic state groups, and we know that there's quite high levels of income affecting children. So we've used the number of children and young people in an area. We've used the income affecting children, income deprivation affecting children. And then we've used another layer. Just going to, actually, I'll leave the primary school on. I'll turn that off, and I'm just going to, we can get some data from Sport England on a regular basis that tells us that estimates the level of inactivity. So how many adults are not achieving, are doing very little, less than 30 minutes a week, and they basically give us these small area estimates. And what you can see here is it tells us that the orange areas, it's estimated between 28 and 31% of the adults in that population are inactive. This red patch over here, it's between 31% and 39%. So when I just zoom, let me just zoom out a little bit. What you'll see is this patchwork quilt based on, they're slightly bigger areas. These are called middle super output areas, these patches. Middle super output areas are between 5 and 15,000 people. A lower super output area is between 1 and 5,000 people. So what we've done is we've taken where are our high levels of children and young people, where are our high levels of children and young people that are experiencing income deprivation, and where are our areas that are inactive but we're using adult data? How does that overlay on top? And we've basically used the red and orange areas. So these are areas that have got higher levels of adult inactivity. We can't get that same inactivity data for children and young people, otherwise we'd have used that. So we're using the adult as a bit of a proxy. There's some, you know, it's a pretty reasonable proxy because there's quite a strong association between inactive parents, inactive children. And so, or certainly less active as the term is used in the data that I showed you earlier. So we've used these three factors. Where are our children and young people in greater numbers? Where are those that are experiencing income deprivation? And how does that overlay with what data that we can get at a lower level around inactivity? And what that gives us is it gives us these areas, when I can find them. See, we've even called them suggested. This is not set in stone. If you think, oh my God, why have they used that method? They should try using this. You can tell us that, and we can think about whether we can make it better. And just, I can just click my bookmark and go out to the Humber region. You can see now we've got primary schools turned on, and we've got these little red areas. These are the areas where those three factors overlay the most. And it starts to identify areas where we are pretty reasonably confident that we can find children and young people that are inactive, and from the groups that we really need to be understanding and thinking about how we shift their behaviour. And so let's just center that and then zoom in again on Scunthorpe. Let's go back to Westcliff. So we know that this school falls within an area where there's a lot of children and young people. A lot of them will be experiencing income deprivation, and inactivity is higher in the local adult population. you can also then start to explore, well, what else can we tell about that community? Well, we've got some things on here around whether they do 2 hours of PE. Actually, I can turn the primary schools off now. Let me just touch with it. So have they got, what do we know about the primary schools and primary school games mark? Well, there we go. We've got some that either we haven't got data for them or they're not involved in it, because some of the other schools in the local community have got a school games mark. We haven't got some of the, we've got some stuff on swim entertainment, I think. Yes, we have. So we've got, let me just zoom in a bit more. You'll be able to see it a bit better. You can see that the different coloured dots now mean different in terms of school swim entertainment percentage. You can see that Westcliffe's school swim is quite low. And it's got a bit of a red dot in comparison to some of the others that are a little bit different. So we just tried to overlay. This is one of my favorites. It's going to get bonkers, by the way, but let me just turn a couple of layers on. I'm going to, I might leave that on and see whether it works. I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to put the primary schools on. Primary schools, there we go. And now I'm going to turn on walking distance. Stick with me. I know it's gone a bit crazy, but I can highlight the walking distance. So this is a 15-minute walking distance, 1,250 meters. Might be a bit large, that we might want to make it a bit smaller, but we've gone with that for the moment. So you can see that blue, if I zoom in a bit more, you can see that blue outline now that shows us the 15-minute walking distance of Westcliff Primary School. Okay, I'm going to turn the priority areas off for a minute because I think you can see that it falls within them, and I'm going to turn on clubs. Okay, so this is a club database where by no means are we saying that this is complete, the club database, but it's probably the best that we've got at the current time. And you can start to see these little pins come up with different clubs. That's a swimming club down and based at the Riddings Pool. This is Scunthorpe Volleyball. You can start to see where some of the provision that we've got information for falls around the school that we were looking at. Let's just try and get that walking layer back. It's gone, hasn't it? There we go. And so you can start to see how we can bring in other layers of information to help us understand the impact of the environment and the impact and the relevance of our programs to schools in certain areas. We've got other things on here that you might be interested in supporting, like our where our Asian community is living in greater numbers. So the area that we're looking at is more of a white British community. If you zoom out, you can see the more northern part of Scunthorpe is definitely more diverse. If we put our Black African Caribbean community on, those were from mixed ethnic groups, you can see that the pattern is more north, and that the community that we were looking at a minute ago is more white British. We've got the childhood obesity data on here. This is year 6, I think. And so you can see how we've put different layers of information on related to demographics, related to health inequalities, related to school, the kind of engagements, the kind of things that we might be doing with schools, the different programs that are available, swimming attainment. We've got some stuff on here around Ofsted and progress scores. I think I need to turn the primary schools off. And you can, if we click on these, it tells us, it gives us the Ofsted rating as the coloured dot. But then the pop-up box, if we click on the dot, the pop-up box comes up with the progress scores. And so you can see how we've layered a lot of other information on to help us try and make sense of physical activity within the context of these communities. See, I told you it would do it at some point. Let me just get back to North Lincolnshire. One of my favorites, another one of my favorites, if I turn that off, I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to turn this on. So which one? We'll do primary school free school meals. The bigger the circle, the higher the proportion of children in that school in free school meals. So we've mapped that for all of the primary schools and secondary schools. So if I turn that one off, that's primary schools, this is secondary schools. So we know where more of the children are, or the schools are with more of the children in receipt of, a greater proportion of the children in receipt of free school meals. We've taken a similar approach to schools that have got a higher proportion of children that have got a SEND statement. And so you can start to see where those schools might fall within the context of some of the other bits of information. And you can think about how you might want to build this up to try and understand a particular school or a particular community that you're trying to work with. That's it. Unless there's something you want me to show you, try and show you. Any thoughts, any questions? Have you had a play with it?
Not yet, but thank you.
I have a bit of a question actually, Scott.
Yeah.
I would be interested to know if anyone did have any of their own information that they'd also like to see plotted on the map.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously you don't have to say now, you can think about it and send it through, but it's obviously there to be used, so anything that could be added to it is good.
I think we would like a discussion around that with our data team, our iHub within the local authority. I think that'd be excellent. Some potential, some collaboration, some further layers, etc., to be fully utilised. Really good.
That sounds really good.
Yeah.
And I have asked Helen, who does our mapping, whether we could, you know, how easy it would be for us to split this out and do a North Lincolnshire specific one. It's not a massive piece of work. So if you've got, because what I would say is the more layers that go on there that are different for different, you know, so North Lincolnshire want to put this on, but Hull want to put this on, you know, the more complicated that gets, the more challenging the map becomes to navigate and utilize. So I think if we've got desire to try and do something with this locally, I think we should look at trying to separate it out, but also maybe keeping a core. If there's some stuff, if it's factors that are that probably data is available across all 4 areas, then let's just add it.
Hi, can you tell me how old is the free school meals data? I'm just thinking of the HAF project. That
I think it will be pretty much as bang up to date as we can get it.
Kathy, I think it was brought from the education database system, so it's as up to date as the last census, I think.
the census.
Yes, the school census.
School census.
School
Oh, right,
census.
okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
Right,
school
so
census do it 3 times a year, so it'll be as up to date as that's come through, I would think.
Right, that's great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Anything else?
I'm just in my mind thinking really, you know, where we should take it to various partnerships, you know, in terms of our enablement role for others, whether that's, I don't know, Liz, what the plans are to share it with the schools community or the Children and Young People's Partnership, One Family Approach, you know, that type. Maybe we need a conversation about that strategy to push it out so that, you know, it's information to be really helpful for people in terms of intervention.
Yeah, I guess today was just almost sharing what it looks like and what's people's thoughts on how it looks and what information should be added or could be added or is not needed from it. And then certainly, I mean, Scott's shared the link in terms of that public domain. There's like you said, there's no issues with it getting lost. I guess it's just the protection around some of the information on there, but I think it's all in the public domain, isn't it, Scott? So it's not something that we need to sensitively look after in terms of the sharing of it.
Yeah, there isn't anything on there of concern as far as I'm aware. Yeah, the information has either come from yourselves or is publicly available, or is it's come from the school census. That's pretty much the main data sources is the adult census, school census, public health data, it's all that kind of information. So there's nothing really. If there's anything that's sensitive, it's the program stuff that's come from yourselves, and you were all happy for it to be shared. So,
is it? I guess there's a question, Jane, just in terms of the. Without wanting to overwhelm people with it all being all together, I guess it's where we take it, and yeah, maybe a smaller group of people to discuss where it needs to go and what influence it can have, because it could form quite a good piece for strategic priorities and things, I would think. But yeah, I would welcome thoughts in terms of where it would sit and where it can be used to influence, because that's exactly what insight should be used for, isn't it? So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd agree with you, Liz. We can pull together maybe Jemima and Darren and maybe somebody from children, maybe Tom Hewitt or something like that, just to start having a think about that sort of strategy behind it, really.
Definitely.
I mean, at the Children Young People's Partnership on Tuesday, you know, we were already sharing. It wasn't to this level, Scott. What we were looking at was the growth in free school meals numbers so quickly, you know, during the last year of COVID, right up until literally just before Easter. So it went on the school census data and then just went that little bit further with the other ones that we've picked up since the January date. And I was showing people how we could use something like a heat map to then project forward, you know, so that you can use the growth stats and things like that to help you work out what the summer's going to be like. You already are where I was heading with the I hope. We're behind you, if that makes sense. But what you've got on here was where I was heading. That, you know, you've got your heat maps. You're working at your medium and your low super, you know, your low super output areas kind of thing. I think for me, if I was looking, Liz, for the next bit, thinking about the half, I would also be looking at what other groups we could put on there that could pick up and do something with physical activities, you know, where physical activity isn't their prime mover at the moment. But they could start to incorporate physical activity. So with brownies and guides, you know, could you do something physical and things like that, you know? And the other thing, Scott, I'd be quite interested in is we're starting to look very much at our food network and where our pantries and our kitchens and our food banks are, because again, the healthy nutrition side, and perhaps, you know, if you're going to cook something, what's the energy balance, how long it would take you to sort of like, you know, which is where, I don't know if you've seen Leeds Food Network, but they've done very similar to what you've got here. They've got, you know, again, the heat maps, the places where people do physical activity, and then the links through to where you can link up on your food network and things like that to get a healthy meal, which has included allotments and things like that, to do the full 360, really.
Yeah,
sounds good.
That's just made me think of one thing that I don't think's on it is green spaces. I don't think any of that on that, but that could be a layer that we could add.
You could put on as well.
Yeah,
absolutely, because I mean we're incredibly lucky in this area. We've got a lot of green spaces, but people don't always know where they are.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of hidden nature reserves.
Yeah. So I think there's probably another layer that we could put on from that. We've been trying to explore with Sport England, doing on some of the facilities stuff, but it changes. Just kind of updating it kind of issue that's a bit of, we can add it on though. It's something that can be done. So there's some bits there that might be worth considering. Have any of you got any thoughts on the logic that we've kind of taken to identify these priority areas? Did it make sense? Does it stack up with what you've heard in terms of the data earlier, and then the logic of trying to identify some communities where we probably need to understand a bit more better what's going on with physical activity for children and young people?
I think it was good to have target points. I'm not sure if there was any surprises based on the people that are here. So I guess that was an interesting thing for me. The value in us having that on levels for all schools is almost finding that commonality across schools, or similarly finding the low seg groups but that's got high levels of activity, and almost those anomalies where you can kind of then almost share learning across different patches. So why are they, you know, kind of a thing to the norm? So I think I mean, Westcliff, I think everybody here would have identified. I think we've got some people that are doing some specific project work in that area due to that kind of demographic of that area. But what would be interesting to pick up is almost, from my point of view, the anomalies of where we're seeing, things that are not quite the norm, and actually using the learning from those areas to maybe influence those patches as well would be my thoughts. But I guess that's like finding a needle in a haystack maybe, but I don't know whether that would be easy to pick out.
I think the other thing for me I really liked was I liked the breakdown where you did the positive attitudes, Scott, because I think we sometimes think as providers that actually enjoyment is perhaps the overruling positive attitude. And if they haven't enjoyed it, they don't come back. And I absolutely get that. If they haven't enjoyed it, they don't come back. But the fact that actually we can also look at things like the confidence, you know, how are the kids feeling about competency? Because in out of school sports that we run, which are multi-sport sessions and things like that, you know, we don't always break stuff down into skills because the kids don't always want that can feel a bit schooly. But perhaps we could sort of like have a bit of a look at that and think, are there ways that we can kind of break things down a little bit into skills without it feeling schooly? The people on the call who kind of helped me with this are probably shouting at the keyboard now, going, "No, Mags!" But and things like, you know, that the understanding and the knowledge bit as well. I think that's really interesting as well. So I quite like those positive attitudes, because I know we're definitely focused on the enjoyment bit, but I don't think we've thought in depth into that bit.
There's a simple set of questions in that questionnaire that you could easily use.
Yeah,
they're pretty straightforward. They would be easy to just use on occasion to test where the young people are, because there is such a strong correlation with that strength of feeling. It really does make a really big difference, and given the pandemic, I think we need to pay more attention to it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you for that.
Okay, any other questions or thoughts? We're kind of coming to the end of this session now with Scott. I guess what would be useful, if you are interested in us kind of forming in a bit of a smaller group to have a look at the next steps, if you could pop your name in the chat just before you leave. I know people probably aren't confident to put their name up and put their hands up virtually. It'd probably help me in terms of identifying people as well, because everybody's initials on my screen. So if you do fancy joining a smaller group and seeing what the next steps are, where we can link it in, and kind of using this intelligence for that things, if you could put your name in the chat, that'd be great, and I'll look to put together a meeting for us all. But yeah, if there's no other questions, big thanks to Scott. It's been really useful. I've seen it a couple of times now, and it's always full of learning and stuff. So hopefully people can go in, click on the link, have a bit of a play, and see if anything else sparks, and hopefully those discussions can formulate from that next step.
Or if there's anything missing, you know, just be interested in thoughts. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Scott.
All right.
Thank
Thanks
you.
all.
Thank
Nice to
you.
meet you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.